Hey everybody, I'm Scott. It's fundraising time again at antiwar.com. We need your help, and here's how you can help. Stop by antiwar.com/donate or call Angela Keaton, our development director, at 323-512-7095. That's 323-512-7095, or you can shoot her an email over to akeaton@antiwar.com.
Thank you very much for your support.
All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our next guest on the show is Jason Leopold. He's an investigative reporter and the deputy managing editor at Truthout.org. He's the author of the national bestseller News Junkie, a memoir. Welcome back to the show, Jason. How are you?
Hey, Scott. Great to be back with you. Thanks so much.
Well, I'm very happy to have you here, and you've got a very important piece here I want to recommend very highly to everyone. My Tortured Journey with former Guantanamo detainee David Hicks. And there's a link right here at the top to the full transcript of your, I believe, exclusive first interview with David Hicks since being released from the gulag down in Cuba. And you've decided, and you explain why in the beginning of the article here, you decided to write this article from a personal point of view to go along with the actual transcript of the interview there. And so I was thinking that would be a pretty good place to start this interview with why it is that you chose to write this piece about the interview the way that you did.
Well, it's a number of reasons, Scott. And, you know, as I say in my piece, I've never spoken to a former Guantanamo detainee before. And I've never spoken to anyone who has been tortured the way David Hicks was tortured. And we know that there are a lot of folks out there, a lot of detainees who were tortured in our name, war on terror, whatever.
Yeah, 700-something of them, right?
Yeah. So, you know, when David Hicks, let me just back up for a moment. He released a memoir last October called Guantanamo: My Journey, and I read the book, and it really affected me. And I'm not sure if people realize, but there are a few detainees out there, former detainees who have been released, who have written books, and I would really encourage people to take the time to read it, because read those books, because they're truly important. Anyway, I read the book. It impacted me. I had an opportunity to actually interview David Hicks, the very first interview. He, since being released and after the book came out. And as I sat down to try to write this story, I wanted to write it. I really did want to write it just as a straight news story. Here's a guy who was tortured. Here's a guy who, was in Afghanistan in these. He was in training camps. I mean, he was there in 2002, and he was sold to U.S. forces. And as I started to write the story, I had so much difficulty finding the words. I'm sort of at a loss of words right now. I just could not seem to come up with the words or think of the words of how to write it. And I really was impacted by it and by my conversations with him over the past 2 months, because it affected me emotionally. And I started to dig deep and figure out what was going on. Why was I drawing a blank? And as I say in my story, I really empathized with David Hicks. I empathized with a guy who found himself in Afghanistan associating with jihadists. And as I indicated in my story, I empathized because I understood probably better than anyone how that could happen, simply because of my own story, my own personal story, which I sort of alluded to, and which is covered in my own book, which came out about 5 years ago. And I felt that if I were to be honest and just say, right, how I felt, how speaking to David Hicks and 2 former Guantanamo guards who have come forward to talk about his torture and how everyone was affected by it, how torture affected me, hearing about it, how it affected the guards. I felt that would be the best way to try and explain to the public, explain to my readers that how this is truly something that we all need to really pay closer attention to and care about. And so I just decided to do that, and I had no idea how the story would end up, where it would, what direction it would take. And so it just turned into sort of somewhat of a first-person narrative on how it really emotionally affected me as a journalist. And as I say at the end of the article, I realized that torture does affect everyone. Torture not only permanently scars the victim of torture, but everyone who comes in contact with that person. And whatever anyone may think about David Hicks, or whatever feelings they may have about him, and what he has been accused of, or his presence in Afghanistan, it all comes down to the fact that no one deserves to be treated this way. No one deserves to be tortured. As I was writing the story, I realized as well that, Scott, I've been obsessed with the Bush administration's torture program for more than 5 years now, almost a decade. I've been writing about it.
Yeah, I feel you.
And I really don't know why. But as I say in the story, I just know that these crimes committed in our name, it truly haunts me. And when you speak to someone who was actually there, they start telling you about their being injected with unknown drugs, being put in solitary confinement, being beaten for 10 hours. I mean, let me just say that, David Hicks told me he was beaten for 10 hours, but he calls it, a mild beating. I mean, that's how much they've broken down these people, to the point where it's like, it was just a mild beating compared to someone else who, was waterboarded, shocked. It comes down to, we just don't know the extent of someone's pain. We still don't know the extent of what happened there and what's continuing to happen over there at Guantanamo. And I had no idea that this, that I would be so affected by it. And I figured, as I said, that I'd get on the phone with him. I'd do his, he'd do his first interview. I'd give him the opportunity to discuss what happened, and he did, and I certainly make that as you noted, the transcript available. But I just felt that maybe people would look at this story differently, the torture story differently, if I were able to be vulnerable and share what this did to me. And it was uncomfortable because, as I said, I empathized with him. And I understood, how he ended up there due to my own personal, story and troubles that I've had in my own past. But I felt that maybe people would just look at it differently, and it was a departure for me, because as a journalist, you're always taught, hey, you're not supposed to get too close to, your interview subjects. You're not supposed to sort of be vulnerable. And I just felt that, if I were to approach the story any other way, what would happen? It would be like, oh, hey, yeah, another guy tortured, and that's the end of the story. We've how many of those stories like that have we read thus far?
Well, it is a risk, but I think it works. I think it's a very important article. It's a hell of a read. My Tortured Journey with former Guantanamo detainee David Hicks, and we'll get more specific about the facts of the case with Jason Leopold from Truthout.org right after this. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm talking with Jason Leopold from Truthout.org, author of My Tortured Journey with former Guantanamo detainee David Hicks. A very important story. I urge you to read it. I plead with you Okay, so now tell us, Jason, what was it about what you learned from this guy that affected you so much that you had to end up writing the piece this way?
Well, it was his backstory, really, Scott. It was, David Hicks dropped out of high school. He was, somewhat of a drifter, looking to belong to something. He ended up, abusing drugs, alcohol, ingratiating himself with, a wide range of characters. And for me, I wrote my own memoir 5 years ago called News Junkie. And aside from the fact talking about my work as a journalist, I talked about how my past informed my professional life. And one thing that I talk about is that in my early 20s, I too was looking to belong to something, felt a need for attention, and ingratiated myself with making a terrible decision, ingratiating myself with some made members of a New York crime family, which I paid a heavy price for. And so reading how this guy who grew up in Australia, came from a pretty good family. His dad campaigned for his, for his release. I understood. I understood how someone, loses their way, and it just really affected me that way. I mean, this was a guy who, just started reading up on so many different things, he, back in, I think it was 1999, decided to convert to Islam, and, did that, and, at the time David Hicks is only, he's 36 years old right now, so he was a young guy, naive, full of bravado, very impressionable, individual, and, just got sort of, fell into these, making some really bad decisions, and obviously those bad decisions he paid a heavy price for, you take that and it's like, how the heck did a guy like this end up in Afghanistan? And let me just point out that not everyone who goes to Afghanistan, is a terrorist. Not everyone who goes to Yemen is a terrorist. He went out there, thought he was going to be enlightened, ended up, like I said, associating with jihadists. He was in a
even going to the training camps there for years and years before and after the Soviet occupation there was sort of a rite of passage for Muslim young men all over the world to just go through the camps and whatever. That doesn't mean you work for Osama now.
That's exactly true.
Tens of thousands of people went through there.
Absolutely. And what I really learned is how uninformed people are. Truly, the public is so uninformed. Has such a poor grasp on history, particularly not U.S. history, just world history. Understanding what this means. I mean, we are so lap up whatever government officials tell us, and it was just amazing. And as I said in the piece, it actually. I realize that I, too, to some degree, feel like I've been conditioned over the past 10 years, to think about anyone who, steps foot in Afghanistan, that does not wear a uniform or is embedded with, some military unit is a terrorist. And as I was writing the story, I realized that. To say that I empathize with David Hicks and understood how this happened to him and why he, made the decisions that he did, it actually did scare me because I truly feared, Scott, that that I would be accused of being some sort of terrorist sympathizer simply because of what people how we have such a knee-jerk reaction to hearing these stories without having a true grasp on history, and that's because the disinformation that's peddled by Democrats and Republicans when it comes to particularly over the past 10 years when it comes to wars and military and terrorism, etc. Long list, which I know that you're very informed about. But it was something. For me, this was truly a journey, and one that was tortured, and one that I also learned a lot about myself, and I'm just amazed that people just don't care enough to take the time to understand how first of all, to have any compassion. One of the things that I should say is that not in the U.S. but in Australia, the media there has really vilified this guy, David Hicks, basically saying that he deserved it. He was in Afghanistan, so he deserved to be tortured. And without actually knowing, or I should say, without actually caring how the Howard government, Prime Minister John Howard there, total Bush lackey, manipulated his case, basically forced the guy to plead guilty to providing material support for terrorism 5 years after he had already been in Guantanamo, much of which was spent in solitary confinement, because he was John Howard was concerned that any further imprisonment would hurt his reelection chances. And let me just say that there's documents out there on that, and it's been well documented that Dick Cheney, paid a visit to Howard back in 2007, early 2007, to discuss Iraq. The David Hicks case came up. Howard urged Cheney to do something about it. Cheney comes back, calls up the convening, judge over at, presiding over the military commissions, gets some sort of, charge against David Hicks, and basically says, hey, you got to plead guilty to this, then we'll let you out of here, which he did. I mean, at that point, he was already there for 5.5 years, and they let him out. But again, it's they didn't have any evidence really against him, and as you noted, just being at a training camp is not evidence enough. It's not enough evidence to say that someone's a terrorist. So they, providing material support for terrorism, that was a war crimes charge that was inserted into the 2006 Military Commissions Act, which Obama said was and everyone agreed, including some courts, was a highly flawed judicial process designed to just obtain guilty pleas. And so the whole thing is that who's the real who are the real criminals in a sense? You got a guy here. Okay, he was out there, and if they had any evidence that he committed a crime, prosecute him for that. But they didn't. So they made it up, and then you had the political interference, malfeasance, taking place as a result, and here we are.
Hey, Jason, let me keep you one more segment here.
You got it.
All right, it'll be a long break for the top of the hour here. Then when we get back, we'll have more with Jason Leopold from Truthout.org. My Tortured Journey with Former Guantanamo Detainee David Hicks is the title of the piece. It's Anti-War Radio. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Jason Leopold from Truthout.org. The article is My Tortured Journey with Former Guantanamo Detainee David Hicks. And so now, I think, Jason, we've established, the guy's name is David Hicks. He could be from Houston. He's from Australia, which, I think they're on the human like us list, help us fight against the commies in Vietnam, right? And our loyal ally, part of our Commonwealth that we inherited from the British after World War II there, and we're good friends with them, and he's more or less white-looking and stuff, so I think we've established he's a human being, and I think you've established that, he was running with the wrong crowd but hadn't really done anything. But so now the important point to get to, assuming we've convinced anyone that this guy David Hicks is human, is the inhuman things that were done to him.
Yeah.
And you cover that pretty thoroughly in this article here, and it's a nightmare, for anybody who's ever had a really bad headache or a toothache or a broken bone or something. You think about how bad that hurts, and then think about someone doing that to you, and then some, as described in this article. Please elaborate.
Yeah, David said that, from the first moment that he was captured, he realized that torture was going to become a reality because he was, in his first interrogations at first, it was beatings. Just, he was just beaten to a pulp, and, one beating for 10 hours. From there, once he was transferred to Guantanamo, he was injected with unknown substances in the back of his neck. He was sodomized with foreign objects, beaten again at Guantanamo. He needed a hernia operation and was told that if he did not say certain things that they wanted to hear, he would not be able to get that operation. He was given other sort of forced to take other medications against his will. And basically what he said is that if you decline to take medication, pills, whatever it is, basically they had this immediate reaction force, what they called the Earth Team, who would come in and basically beat you down and force you to take it. I mean, do people understand that, there's, we're holding, I realize that they're not prisoners, they're called detainees, and we're forcing them to, take medication, take things that they have no idea what they're taking against their will. He said that, the injections in the back of his neck, were, he ended up hallucinating, and that happened regularly. And then, of course, I think what's really important to note is that the, solitary confinement, 23 hours a day for almost a year. That's truly torture, by the way. People think just, being locked up, and I realize that, there are folks out there that will say, hey, we do that a lot here in maximum security. Solitary confinement is torture, and the way that it was done to David was really torture because they did it right after they, filed charges against him. And so basically what they did is that they put him in solitary confinement, keeping him away from, he had no contact with anyone. And it was designed to psychologically, break him down to the point where they could extract a confession from him. We've of course have the shackling, loud music, cold temperatures. For David, being in an extremely cold temperature was particularly torturous because he's something that he's not used to, and he said he feared, and so they exploited those fears. Some of the other things that they did was they would use chainsaws and rev them up to induce fear. And, in addition to that, it was the, I'm just going over in my head some of the things that he was telling me. And just,
you say in the article, you talk about, and these are things that we've heard of, I think not so much in specific cases, but just, in general, the use of extreme cold and stress positions and strobe lights and extremely loud music and
right.
And then, of course, just the regular beatings that go along with all of that. The I don't know, was he part of the frequent flyer program down there at Guantanamo where they move you from cell to cell every 10 minutes or something so you can't get a single wink of sleep for 2 weeks?
Yeah, he was not part of the frequent flyer program, but he was interrogated almost every single day. And, the one thing about David, and this is what some of the former guards who are quoted in the story, came forward to say, is that, who knew David, is to basically say that, he's a guy that was easily manipulated, and I think that sort of underscores sort of the point of how he ended up in the position that he ended up in, and that led to his capture and arrest. He just wanted the interrogations to stop, so he would just sign a document. He would do whatever the government, the military said you should do in order to get those things to stop. And he feels very guilty about the fact that he was so weak that he simply gave into it. It's truly heartbreaking. I mean, one of the things I noted early was that he was sodomized with foreign objects. I mean, that is just the way that the way that he was describing it for me was horrific. I mean, in some ways he feels guilty that his I didn't really get into this in the story, but I will tell you that he feels guilty actually saying the word torture, because he felt that his treatment did not measure up to the treatment of others who were treated worse, other detainees, whether it's waterboarding, he said electric shock. So he feels guilty actually using the word torture. In some ways, it's almost as if he's sounded like a rape victim who, felt guilty actually, feels guilty saying the word rape, or thinking that, this was, not really, perhaps not rape, So it took a lot to convince him that he was, his treatment was torture.
Sure sounds like torture to me, but you can see how he would think so because of what he knows was done to other people much worse.
Right.
Choreographed from the White House by the Principals Committee. He can't. He can't help but it's like survivor's guilt, right? I didn't have it nearly as bad as some of the other guys, but that doesn't really diminish what he went through.
Exactly, and that's it, survivor's guilt, and
and by the way, for people, no matter how guilty this guy is, nobody deserves that. But just for the record, Cheney gave him $50 in time served, like night court here. He wasn't the worst of the worst. He wasn't an Al-Qaeda terrorist. He never did nothing to nobody, this guy. He's just some guy they scooped up in Afghanistan, that's it.
He was, exactly.
So they torture him within a foot of his life instead of an inch. Like, that ought to somehow be an apology.
And that is, when I started really looking at it, Scott, from the way after speaking to him, checking out, going back and looking at some past articles and doing some research, that was the attitude. Well, that's not so bad compared to some of the more horrific things that we've done. But he does talk about what he thought was experimentation as well, going on there, and I think that his book is just. It's truly eye-opening.
All right. Well, listen, I hope everyone reads this article, My Torture Journey with Former Guantanamo Detainee David Hicks. It's by Jason Leopold at Truthout.org, and he's also, of course, the author of the book News Junkie, a memoir. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it, Jason.
Scott, thank you. Appreciate it.